Chapter 1. Solitary Women, Silent Rooms. Hey guys! Tonight we're going to talk about women who did something a little unusual, at least by the standards of, well, almost every century before the 20th. They lived alone. Without a husband, without a male guardian, without a head of household looming over the dinner table. So, get comfortable. Dim the lights. You can put down your phone, unless, of course, you're using it to listen to me right now. In that case, keep it where it is, and let the soft blue glow of your screen light up your increasingly sleepy expression. Because tonight, we're gliding into the quiet, drafty rooms of history's loneliest women. The ones who refused or simply never managed to attach themselves to a man and lived to be mildly judged for it. Let's start with a simple fact. In pre-modern Europe, living alone as a woman was weird. Not scandalous enough to cause a riot, unless you also happen to own land or read Latin, but strange enough to earn whispers from the neighbors. Most women were legally, socially, or economically tied to a man. A father, a husband, a brother, a boss. Sometimes, disturbingly, all of the above. And yet, tucked away in city alleys and countryside manors, some women managed to live by themselves. Now, by themselves is relative. Even the most independent medieval spinster still needed servants, because apparently washing your own laundry was considered a form of public humiliation. But in essence, these women were unanchored. Their lives weren't arranged around male authority. They occupied the tiny, awkward space between suspicion and freedom. Let's meet one. Christine de Pizan, the medieval girl boss nobody ordered. Christine de Pizan was born in 1364 in Venice, which already gives her points for scenic origin, but she grew up in the French court. Her father was a scholar, which meant he spent a lot of time arguing with men in robes about astrology. Christine, however, had the audacity to learn how to read. By her mid-20s, she was widowed, left with 3 kids, a mother to support, and a pile of unpaid bills. In short, the medieval starter pack for disaster. But instead of remarrying, the socially acceptable response, she decided to write for money. Yes, she became one of Europe's first professional female writers, which was about as shocking then as a horse enrolling in university. Her poems, letters, and essays defended women's intelligence and virtue, which sounds lovely now, but in 1400 it was basically declaring emotional war on the patriarchy. She even wrote the Book of the City of Ladies, where she imagined a whole city built by and for women, ruled by reason and morality. A fantasy, obviously, because at the time, women couldn't even inherit property without being accused of witchcraft. And yet, Christine made a living. She supported her family with her pen, survived political chaos, and never took another husband. In the polite language of history, she remained a widow. In modern terms, she said, "No thanks, I've done that once." Her independence didn't make her rich, but it made her noticeable. Men admired her intellect but found her inconvenient. Clerics praised her virtue but told her to calm down. Even the king tolerated her because she made him look like a patron of learning. Christine spent her later years in a convent, not because she wanted to hide, but because it was quiet. She died around 1430, peacefully, after decades of writing about women who deserved better. So, our first solitary woman didn't live alone in isolation, but in defiance. She turned widowhood, a social misfortune, into professional liberation. A medieval miracle powered by ink and stubbornness. Let's float over to another lonely room. The Beguines, women who ghosted marriage and the church. Imagine medieval Europe again, but this time, picture a quiet cluster of small brick houses surrounded by a garden. Inside, women lived together not as nuns, but not as wives either. These were the Beguines, an unofficial, semi-religious sisterhood that sprouted across the Low Countries in the 13th century. Think of them as the spiritual freelancers of medieval Christianity. They didn't take permanent vows. They didn't live under strict church control. They worked, prayed, taught, and supported themselves, all without the logistical nightmare of being someone's property. Naturally, this terrified both the clergy and the patriarchy. A woman who didn't need male protection was considered a theological problem. People whispered that Beguines were suspiciously happy. Some even accused them of heresy, because nothing says faithful devotion like condemning women for praying too independently. But the Beguines persisted. They built small communities, beguinages, where they lived modestly but freely. They ran hospitals, taught girls to read, and cared for the sick. For hundreds of years, they existed in this blurry, unregulated space between saintly and scandalous. And what's wild is that they did it without any official approval. No pope signed off. No bishop supervised. It was female self-organization centuries before feminism had a name. The last Beguine died in 2013. Yes, 2013. Her name was Marcella Patten, and she lived in Belgium. She was nearly 100. The last whisper of a movement that began before the Black Death. It's a strange thought, that the Middle Ages, so often caricatured as a time of total female helplessness, quietly nurtured 1,000 tiny acts of autonomy. Some of them lasted longer than kingdoms. Let's move from convent-like serenity to something far less organized, the noblewoman's version of solitude. Lady Anne Clifford, the countess who refused to shut up. Fast forward to 17th century England. Lady Anne Clifford was born in 1590 into wealth, titles, and drama, basically the Tudor reality TV version of nobility. Her father, the Earl of Cumberland, died when she was 15 and decided, because of course he did, to leave his estates to his brother instead of his daughter. Anne Clifford, however, didn't do quiet disappointment. She spent decades, literal decades, fighting in court for her inheritance. While most noblewomen busied themselves with embroidery and tolerating their husbands, Anne collected legal documents, plotted genealogies, and wrote outrageously detailed diaries about how unfair everyone was. Her first husband tried to convince her to give up the claim. Her mother urged peace. The king himself suggested she let it go. And Clifford declined. She finally won, at 60. By then, most of her male relatives were either dead or too tired to argue. Widowed twice, she spent her later years restoring castles in northern England and micromanaging everything from church repairs to local disputes. She lived alone, surrounded by portraits of her ancestors, writing smug notes in the margins of her estate papers. She also left behind a massive diary, tens of thousands of words, describing weather, politics, servants, and her daily triumph of being right all along. And wasn't just independent. She was administratively independent. The bureaucratic queen of solitude. And what's interesting is how much her society disliked that. She was admired for her strength but mocked for her stubbornness, the eternal double bind of powerful women. Even centuries later, historians called her difficult, which is usually code for refuse to obey mediocre men. Let's float from England's grey castles to the sun-bleached villas of Renaissance Italy, where female solitude looked entirely different, and slightly more scandalous. Veronica Franco, the courtesan who read too much. Venice again, because, apparently, Venice was where all the interesting women hid. Veronica Franco was born in 1546 to a family that couldn't quite decide whether it wanted to be respectable or exciting. Her mother had been a cortigiana onesta, a kind of high-class courtesan who mixed beauty with wit, poetry, and the ability to quote Cicero without blushing. Veronica followed in her footsteps. Now, being a courtesan wasn't exactly living alone, but it was living on your own terms. She chose her patrons. She earned her own money. She owned her own house, something most Venetian wives couldn't legally do. She also published books, poems that addressed her lovers and critics with equal elegance. One line basically says, "If you insult women, you should be prepared for women who can write." She corresponded with noblemen, philosophers, and even the King of France. She hosted literary salons where men actually listened to her, mostly because she was clever enough to make them think it was their idea. But independence always had a shelf life. When plague and politics hit Venice, her fortune vanished. She ended up caring for children and dying quietly at 45, buried without marble or scandal. Yet her words survived, sharp, confident, and deeply aware of her place in a world built to dismiss her. For a woman living without a husband, Veronica's voice was both armor and rebellion. A reminder that solitude wasn't always chosen, but sometimes it was embraced. Let's glide north again, into the stiff collars and chilly parlors of 18th century Europe, where a different kind of loneliness unfolded, intellectual rather than physical. Mary Wollstonecraft, the problem with thinking too much. Before she became the mother of Mary Shelley, yes, the one who wrote Frankenstein, Mary Wollstonecraft was the scandalous philosopher who believed women had rational souls. Radical stuff, apparently. Born in 1759 to a financially unstable family, she worked as a companion, a governess, and eventually, a writer. Her first book argued that women should be educated, not so they could charm men better, but so they could be actual human beings. Her vindication of the rights of women made her famous, or infamous, depending on which man you asked. She traveled to revolutionary France, fell in love, was abandoned, attempted suicide twice, recovered, and kept writing. Through it all, she lived mostly alone. Not by choice at first, but by temperament. She was too restless for domesticity, too principled for comfort, and too idealistic for a society that rewarded obedience. Even when she later married William Godwin, another philosopher, they kept separate homes, because apparently even in love, she preferred her own space. She died giving birth to her daughter at 38. History turned her into a tragic figure, the unhappy feminist. But that's too neat. Her solitude was both wound and weapon. She built a life that didn't fit, and in doing so, cracked open a future for women who would. So, as we close tonight's first chapter, notice the pattern. Every one of these women lived in the margins of acceptability. They were widows, writers, mystics, or courtesans, figures who hovered just outside the circle of sanctioned womanhood. They lived alone not because they hated men, well, maybe some did, but because solitude was the only space where they could exist honestly. Christine de Pizan wrote her Independence. The Beguines built it, and Clifford litigated it. Veronica Franco flirted with it. Mary Wollstonecraft philosophized it. Each, in her own way, proved that a woman without a man wasn't a failure of society, but a quiet test of its imagination. Now, let's drift deeper. Because history has far more lonely women waiting in its echoing corridors, some royal, some chapter 2, queens without kings. Royal solitude was complicated. Technically, queens were never supposed to be alone. Their entire job description was be married to power. And yet, history is full of royal women who found themselves suddenly, or deliberately, single. Sometimes widowed, sometimes dethroned, sometimes just done. Let's begin with one of the most quietly tragic of them all, a woman whose solitude outlasted her throne. Catherine of Aragon, the queen who wouldn't disappear. When Catherine of Aragon arrived in England in 1501, she was 16, charming, and extremely married to Prince Arthur, the heir to the Tudor dynasty. He died 6 months later, which, of course, left her in a diplomatic limbo. Spain wanted her remarried to Arthur's younger brother Henry, who would later become that Henry, the one with all the wives and the questionable judgment. Catherine waited 7 long years for that marriage. 7 years in England, alone, mostly broke, writing desperate letters to her father and surviving on the charity of people who didn't want to offend either side. When she finally did marry Henry, she became the model queen, pious, educated, fluent in Latin, the sort of woman who could embroider a banner and translate a theological essay in the same afternoon. And then, after 24 years of marriage, Henry decided he needed a son, and someone younger to produce it. Catherine refused to step aside. Politely, calmly, endlessly. She said she was Henry's lawful wife and queen, and she repeated that line until she died. He exiled her to a damp castle, stripped her titles, and forbade her from seeing their daughter, Mary. But Catherine never called herself anything other than Queen of England. Her solitude wasn't voluntary, but it was absolute. She wrote letters to friends and dignitaries, signed every one Catherine the Queen, and died at 50 in quiet dignity, while Henry partied with Anne Boleyn in London. Even her tombstone kept it simple, Queen of England. No bitterness, just stubborn serenity, the kind of calm that drives tyrants insane. Margaret of Austria. the widow who ran the Habsburg Empire. Now, let's glide across the channel to the Netherlands in the early 1500s, where another widow quietly ran half of Europe while pretending she was just minding the family business. Margaret of Austria was born into the tangled roots of the Habsburg dynasty, a family tree that really should have stopped marrying itself centuries earlier. She was married off 3 times before the age of 24. Her first fiancé died. Her second husband, the King of France, sent her home after a political fallout. Her third, the Duke of Savoy, actually made it to the altar, only to die in a jousting accident 2 years later. At that point, Margaret declared she was done. No more husbands, no more courtship. She would serve her family and her God, preferably in comfortable widow's gowns and administrative offices. Her father, Emperor Maximilian, conveniently needed someone reliable to govern the Netherlands. So Margaret became regent, the woman in charge of the Habsburg territories north of France. For 2 decades, she negotiated treaties, organized trade, raised her nephew Charles, who'd grow up to be Emperor Charles V, and outsmarted every diplomat who underestimated her. She kept her court refined, her correspondence elegant, and her private life non-existent. Her motto was, "Fortune in fortune, fort un." Roughly, fortune and misfortune make me strong. Margaret's version of solitude wasn't sadness. It was strategy. She turned widowhood into political armor. By refusing to remarry, she avoided being controlled, and became one of the most influential rulers of her age. A quiet power in black velvet. Christina of Sweden, the queen who just walked away. Some women are widowed into solitude. Christina of Sweden simply decided monarchy was boring. Born in 1626, she inherited the throne at 6 after her father died in battle, which, in 17th century Europe, was a fairly standard way for a king to exit. Christina grew up surrounded by scholars and warriors. She read Aristotle, collected books, and developed a famously eccentric personality. She refused to marry, refused to wear appropriate dresses, and refused, most importantly, to keep pretending she wanted to rule. In 1654, she abdicated. Voluntarily. She handed the crown to her cousin, packed her books, converted to Catholicism, a minor scandal in Protestant Sweden, and moved to Rome. There, she lived in what can only be described as glamorous solitude, writing, sponsoring artists, and annoying popes. Her Rome residence became a salon for philosophers, painters, and anyone interesting enough to argue with her. Christina was called everything from brilliant to bizarre. She was short, blunt, socially unpredictable, and absolutely uninterested in expectations. When people asked why she never married, she said she had no inclination for the slavery of marriage, which, coming from a queen, was refreshingly direct. Her independence made her famous and lonely. She died at 62, still in Rome, surrounded by books and unfinished philosophical notes. Christina's life was proof that solitude, when chosen, can look a lot like freedom, even if everyone else calls it madness. Queen Elizabeth I, the Virgin brand ambassador. Elizabeth I didn't just live without a man, she made it a marketing strategy. Her father was Henry VIII. Her mother, Anne Boleyn, was executed when Elizabeth was 2. So, she grew up with an excellent understanding of how marriage could go catastrophically wrong. When she became queen in 1558, everyone assumed she'd marry, partly because it was considered unthinkable for a woman to rule alone, and partly because Europe's princes were lining up like contestants on an awkward reality show. Elizabeth smiled, flirted, hinted, and never said yes. For 45 years. Instead, she cultivated an image, the Virgin Queen, married to her country. She surrounded herself with male courtiers who adored her, rivaled each other, and grew increasingly desperate for attention. She let them think she might marry one of them someday. She never did. Behind the pageantry, Elizabeth was often alone. She wrote melancholy letters, mourned dead friends, and grew weary of constant flattery. But she also understood her solitude was power. As long as she remained unmarried, she belonged to no one. Even when age and politics turned her into a shadow of her former brilliance, she held on to that autonomy. The last portrait painted of her shows a tired, heavily made-up face. A queen who'd outlived everyone's expectations. A woman who, quite literally, ruled alone. Maria Theresa, the matriarch who outlived everyone. Solitude can also come late, after a lifetime of duty. Maria Theresa of Austria, 1717 to 1780, spent her youth doing what royal women did best, marrying advantageously and producing heirs. 16 of them, to be exact. She ran her empire while pregnant half the time, issued decrees between births, and scolded ministers like a mother who'd misplaced her patience. Her husband, Francis Stephen, was pleasant enough, but she was the real ruler. He mostly handled the ceremonial bits while she reorganized the empire, collected taxes, and updated military policy. When he died suddenly in 1765, she broke. For months, she wore black mourning clothes and refused to appear in public. She moved into a smaller palace, dismissed most of her servants, and dedicated herself to religious meditation. Her letters from that period are full of exhaustion, but also relief. Without her husband, she no longer had to pretend to share authority. She ruled absolutely, with her sons serving more as assistants than heirs. For 15 more years, she managed the sprawling Habsburg monarchy from her quiet, candlelit chambers, issuing orders between prayers. By the time she died, she had rebuilt her dynasty, trained her son Joseph II to take over, and turned widowhood into governance. Solitude, for Maria Theresa, was the final phase of control, serene, disciplined, and slightly terrifying. The other kind of solitude, forgotten royal daughters. Not every royal woman had the luxury of ruling alone. Some simply disappeared into solitude. Princesses who were married off to foreign courts and widowed at 25. Duchesses who never married and spent 40 years in abbeys, their portraits slowly gathering dust. In France, unmarried royal daughters were often sent to convents with polite euphemisms like retirement for piety. The reality was quieter. Long corridors, limited visitors, embroidery, and memories of what might have been. In Spain, royal widows wore black for life, sometimes outliving their husbands by decades. One of them, Mariana of Austria, spent 33 years as a widow, ruling as regent, then fading into a kind of religious solitude so complete that she hardly spoke. These women existed in the periphery of history, not disgraced, not celebrated, simply present. They filled letters with pious reflections, supervised estates, or managed households of servants who barely remembered their titles. Their solitude wasn't revolutionary. It was routine. And yet, it preserved something rare in royal life: peace. No political marriages. No childbirth deaths. Just slow afternoons, prayer books, and the sound of distant bells. It's easy to romanticize that, to imagine these queens and princesses as serene figures in candlelight. But solitude, for them, was often survival dressed as dignity. Catherine clung to her title because it was all she had left. Margaret ruled because marriage had failed her 3 times. Christina fled because monarchy suffocated her. Elizabeth refused men because she'd watched them destroy her mother. Maria Theresa mourned her husband, then quietly ruled an empire without him. All of them found, in the empty space left by men, a strange kind of clarity. Royal solitude was never meant to happen, but when it did, it produced some of the most competent rulers Europe ever had. Forgotten, some gloriously strange. Chapter 3: The Art of Being Alone. By the 18th and 19th centuries, women living alone started to look less like tragic accidents of fate and more like curiosities. Society had invented the idea of the spinster, the eccentric, the lady recluse, words that both pitted and mocked. And yet, for some women, solitude became their creative fuel. Their rebellion was quiet, tidy, and perfectly respectable, because what could be more socially harmless than a woman who stays at home and writes? Emily Dickinson, the invisible poet of Amherst. Emily Dickinson didn't set out to become a hermit poet. She just kept retreating. Born in 1830 in Amherst, Massachusetts, she was part of a well-to-do family, educated, polite, and absolutely drenched in Protestant respectability. As a girl, she was lively and witty, known for her letters and quick tongue. But as she grew older, she began to withdraw. By her 30s, she rarely left her family's house. By her 40s, she rarely left her room. Neighbors described seeing her only through a window, a flash of white dress disappearing behind curtains. Visitors were sometimes greeted by her voice from behind the door, never her face. But her solitude wasn't emptiness. It was focus. In that quiet upstairs room, she wrote nearly 2,000 poems. They were small, compressed, lightning-in-a-bottle verses about death, immortality, bees, and bread. She bound them into little booklets she called fascicles, tied neatly with thread, and hid them in drawers. Emily published almost nothing while alive. Only after her death did her family discover the stash, a hidden empire of language built in isolation. Her letters reveal that she wasn't sad, not exactly. She enjoyed her solitude. She once wrote, "I dwell in possibility, a fairer house than prose." She wasn't lonely. She was busy. Her silence wasn't retreat, it was work. And yet, society interpreted her as fragile, reclusive, even mad. Because apparently, a woman choosing silence voluntarily must be unwell. If solitude were a religion, Emily Dickinson was its quiet prophet. Lady Mary Wortley Montagu, the social butterfly who fled the party. Lady Mary was born into English aristocracy in 1689, which meant her expected life trajectory was simple: marry well, smile in public, and never say anything clever. She did the first two and then ruined the third. Brilliant, outspoken, and restless, she married a diplomat and spent years traveling through Europe and the Ottoman Empire. In Constantinople, she witnessed something extraordinary: women being inoculated against smallpox using a crude early form of vaccination. Lady Mary brought the idea back to England, where doctors and clergy both called it unnatural. She calmly ignored them and had her own children inoculated. Her life was full of motion, travel, salons, letters, debates, but in her later years, she did something unthinkable. She left it all. At age 50, she left England and her husband, moved to Italy, and lived alone for over 20 years. In her letters from Venice, she describes her life as peaceful, filled with reading, gardening, and the company of cats. She read Roman poets, wrote witty observations about European society, and kept up correspondence with her daughter, though she refused to return home even when begged. Her solitude was half exile, half retirement. She was tired of the noise. When she finally returned to England, old and ill, she stayed only a year before dying. Her final note to her daughter said simply, "I am so far removed from the noise and nonsense of the world that I could not wish to return to it." Solitude, for Lady Mary, was the ultimate escape, not from people but from performance. The Bronte sisters, solitude as a family business. If you walked across the Yorkshire moors in the 1840s, you might have seen a lonely parsonage half buried in fog. Inside it lived three sisters, Charlotte, Emily, Anne and Bronte, writing novels that would scandalize Victorian England. They lived almost entirely alone, their social circle consisting mostly of their father, their brother, who was busy drinking himself to death, and the occasional neighbor who dared to visit. Emily, the most solitary, rarely left the house. She preferred walking alone on the moors, where she'd murmur lines of poetry to herself. Her only published novel, Wuthering Heights, is one of the bleakest love stories ever written, which makes sense, given her diet of solitude and wind, and was quieter, but no less fierce. She worked briefly as a governess, hated it, and retreated home to write Agnes Grey, a painfully realistic account of how awful that job was. Charlotte, the most ambitious, wrote Jane Eyre and briefly tasted fame, though she too lived most of her life in that same small house, surrounded by ghosts and manuscripts. The Brontes didn't reject society so much as never quite belonged to it. They were too poor for luxury, too educated for simplicity, and too female for authority. Their solitude became their creative crucible. Even after fame came, they stayed in their quiet parsonage. When Emily died, Charlotte wrote that she had to break her loneliness by force, as if solitude itself had become Emily's truest companion. The Brontes' isolation wasn't a tragedy. It was a factory, quietly manufacturing literary masterpieces from silence. Elizabeth V.G. Lebrun, painting herself out of loneliness. Elizabeth V.G. Lebrun was the favorite portraitist of Marie Antoinette, which, in hindsight, was a risky business decision. Born in 1755, she rose quickly in the French art world thanks to her technical brilliance and her ability to flatter even the most insecure noblewoman. Her portraits made the doomed queen look serene, cultured, and only mildly out of touch with poverty. Then came the Revolution. As mobs tore down everything resembling nobility, Vigée Lebrun fled Paris with her young daughter. For the next 12 years, she lived in exile, moving between Italy, Austria, and Russia, painting whoever would sit for her and writing endless letters to the friends she'd left behind. She supported herself entirely through her art, a rarity for any woman, let alone one without male protection or patronage. Her self-portraits tell the story better than words. In early ones, she smiles softly, elegant, and composed. In later works, she's older, thoughtful, still graceful, but alone. When she finally returned to France after the chaos settled, she found her world gone. The salons were quieter, the friends older or dead. She wrote her memoirs, long, reflective, and faintly wistful, and spent her final decades painting flowers and landscapes, the company of people having grown tiresome. Her solitude was the price of survival. And yet, she painted her own piece into existence, brushstroke by brushstroke. Florence Nightingale, the saint of the lamp who hated company. We tend to imagine Florence Nightingale as an angel of mercy, floating through Crimean hospitals with a lantern. But the real Florence was a prickly, hyper-intelligent, chronically annoyed woman who needed solitude like oxygen. Born into a wealthy British family in 1820, she was expected to marry well and host pleasant dinners. She did neither. Instead, she studied statistics, read medical reports, and argued, constantly, that women could do useful work outside the home. Her family thought she was insane. During the Crimean War, she became famous for organizing military hospitals and dramatically lowering death rates. When she returned home, she could have basked in celebrity. Instead, she locked herself in her London room for decades. Literally decades. She wrote thousands of pages of medical reports, designed hospital layouts, and corresponded with world leaders, all from bed. She claimed chronic illness, but letters suggest she simply preferred to work alone. Visitors found her intimidating, sharp, and strangely peaceful. Her solitude wasn't retreat, it was management. She achieved more from her bedroom than most governments managed in years. Florence turned isolation into infrastructure. Edith Sitwell, the human porcelain tower. Every era produces at least one woman so eccentric that even her solitude seems theatrical. In the early 20th century, that was Edith Sitwell. Tall, gaunt, and dressed in flowing robes that made her look like an Art Deco cathedral. Sitwell lived in a London apartment filled with old perfume, velvet curtains, and manuscripts. She never married. She claimed men bored her, and she bored them right back. Her poetry was strange, rhythmic, experimental, all angular sounds and hypnotic repetitions. Critics mocked her for being incomprehensible. She ignored them and hosted poetry readings anyway, declaiming her work in a slow, regal monotone while wearing turbans the size of fruit bowls. Behind the eccentricity was real isolation. She lived with her brother for years, then alone, her only constant company being her writing. When asked once if she was lonely, she replied, "I am a crowd." It was true. Her solitude wasn't empty. It was full of imagination, artifice, and deliberate distance from a world too ordinary for her taste. Edith Sitwell didn't retreat from society. She simply elevated herself above it, like a particularly elegant ghost. Solitude, by the 19th and early 20th centuries, had become a spectrum. For Emily Dickinson, it was a cocoon. For Lady Mary, a retreat. For the Brontes, a condition of genius. For Vigée Lebrun, a form of exile. For Florence Nightingale, an office. For Edith Sitwell, a performance. All of them turned what society pitted, the single, the childless, the withdrawn, into a kind of legacy. Each, in her own stillness, made something enduring. Because the strange truth of women who lived alone is this: history remembered them precisely because they weren't supposed to exist. Chapter 4. The Widow, the Witch, and the Woman Who Refused to Marry. By the late medieval period, society had a tidy little box for every type of woman, except the ones who didn't fit into any. If you were young and unmarried, you were supposed to be someone's daughter, waiting politely for a husband to appear like a parcel delayed in the mail. If you were married, well, your life revolved around your husband's property, your children's stomachs, and the church's schedule. And if you were widowed, congratulations, you had somehow achieved the most freedom medieval womanhood could legally allow. Widows were a strange social category, both respected and feared. On one hand, they were often wealthy, experienced, and legally independent. On the other, they were walking reminders that women could survive perfectly well without men, which was, of course, deeply unsettling to most men of the era. So society wrapped them in a mixture of superstition and suspicion. Too independent? Must be a witch. Too quiet? Probably mourning her last victim. Too cheerful? Clearly up to something. Let's drift gently into that foggy social territory, where the widow became both a symbol of power and danger. In England, by the 14th century, widows could manage estates, hire servants, and even represent themselves in court. That's right. Women who lost their husbands could suddenly do things that married women legally couldn't. Marriage actually reduced a woman's rights. Once wed, her legal identity merged entirely with her husband's. She couldn't sign contracts, own property, or sue anyone. But once widowed, she got it all back, as if society temporarily remembered she was a human being. Some widows took full advantage. Take Catherine de Swynford, for example, mistress of John of Gaunt, Duke of Lancaster, and eventual grandmother to the Tudor dynasty. She spent years as the other woman, whispered about behind fans and veils. When her husband died and John's wife conveniently followed, Catherine did something scandalous. She married John, a duke. Her children, once illegitimate, were legitimized by royal decree. She became one of the most powerful women in England, all because she outlasted the right people. She played the long game, patiently surviving, while the world underestimated her as a quiet widow. But not all widows had dukes waiting around. Some simply refused to remarry, and that was the bigger scandal. A woman turning down a husband was like someone refusing free bread in a famine. People didn't know what to make of it. The church advised widows to remain chaste and devoted to God, which sounded pious enough. But too much independence, even for holy reasons, made the clergy nervous. After all, an unmarried woman managing her own wealth looked suspiciously like self-sufficiency. And self-sufficiency was one step away from heresy. Across Europe, there were countless examples of widows living independently, quietly running businesses, renting out property, or managing inns. In Italy, Venice in particular, the records are full of them. These women were not anomalies. They were the backbone of urban life. Yet you won't find them in the grand histories. Historians loved their kings and their battles, not their widows collecting rent in the Venetian canals. In small English villages, widows were sometimes the only literate people left. They'd keep accounts, witness wills, and even settle disputes. But because that kind of competence didn't fit the fragile woman narrative, people had to invent another explanation. Magic. Clearly, if she could read or count, she must have help from dark forces. Thus began the steady creep from widow to witch. The witch trials of the early modern period didn't start out of nowhere. They grew out of this centuries-old suspicion of independent women, especially those living alone. A widow living on the edge of town, with no man to vouch for her, was the perfect scapegoat. She owned a cow that didn't die last winter? Witchcraft. She baked better bread than her neighbors? Witchcraft. She just existed quietly, unbothered? Definitely witchcraft. One historian once described the medieval widow as a woman on the border between respectability and ruin. Too much grief made her pitted. Too much joy made her dangerous. Her only safe path was quiet moderation, appearing sad enough to honor her late husband, but not so sad that people started whispering about ghosts. Some widows turned this delicate balance into an art form. Take Alice Keitler of Kilkenny, Ireland, born around 1280. She married 4 times, each husband wealthier than the last, and somehow managed to outlive them all by the time the 4th died. His children accused her of witchcraft. Because, obviously, she couldn't possibly have just been a competent businesswoman with excellent taste in husbands. Alice was tried in what's considered one of the first major witchcraft trials in Europe. She escaped execution and fled Ireland. Her maid wasn't so lucky, she was whipped and burned. Alice, though, disappeared from history, presumably with a very full purse. The church couldn't decide whether widows were holy or hazardous. On one hand, they made perfect nuns, obedient, experienced, no dowry required. On the other, their independence and worldliness made them unpredictable. They knew how to run estates, how to argue, how to manipulate men politely, all dangerous skills in cloistered company. And yet, in many ways, widows were the first women to live alone without a man, in a socially semi-acceptable way. They were the loophole, tolerated because they'd done their duty already. They'd married, served, and survived. Now they were simply existing. And for a brief window of time, society left them alone. Unless, of course, they got too rich, too loud, or too successful. Let's drift now toward another category of solo women, not the widows, but the ones who never married at all. The spinsters. The single ladies who spun wool and gossip in equal measure. Because if widows were suspicious, then unmarried women were an even greater mystery. Women who somehow skipped the entire male supervision system entirely. Chapter 5. The Spinster's Quiet Rebellion. There's a certain image that comes to mind when you hear the word spinster. A lonely woman surrounded by cats, perhaps, sitting beside a candle, knitting bitterness into every stitch. But in truth, the term began with something far less tragic. In medieval and early modern Europe, spinster simply meant a woman who spun thread or yarn for a living. It was a trade, and a vital one. Cloth made the world go round, and the women who spun it kept entire economies alive. So, before the word became an insult, it was a job title. Of course, it didn't stay respectable for long. Society has a talent for turning useful women into social warnings. By the 16th century, spinster had shifted from independent worker to unmarried woman of questionable charm. Basically, if you weren't married by your mid-20s, congratulations, you had been promoted to cautionary tale. But in practice, many spinsters lived quietly fulfilling lives. They weren't all sitting around waiting for suitors who never came. Some didn't want husbands at all, and others simply couldn't afford them. Marriage required a dowry, a financial contribution to your own subordination. If your family couldn't provide one, your chances of marrying dropped sharply. So many women turned to crafts, trades, and domestic work instead. They worked as midwives, servants, teachers, or, quite literally, spinners. In the towns of England, France, and the Low Countries, unmarried women formed small social clusters. They often lived together, shared rent, ran shops, or took in laundry. In a sense, they created their own quiet sisterhoods, informal, practical, and mostly invisible in the records. Society didn't pay much attention to them unless they made trouble, which, of course, some of them did. Let's float over to 16th century Norwich, England, a busy textile town buzzing with wool and gossip. There, spinsters were everywhere. They formed the invisible labor force behind the city's prosperity. And while the men took credit as merchants and guild masters, it was the unmarried women who kept the looms turning. Town records show entire households of women pooling money to buy raw wool, spinning it, and selling it back to clothiers. Independent businesswomen, essentially, though the term hadn't been invented yet. Yet, these same women were treated with a curious mix of condescension and suspicion. They were praised for their work ethic, but pitted for their singleness. Respected in daylight, whispered about at night. If one seemed too proud or too comfortable without a man, the village murmured, "She must have a secret." Or worse, "She must have a familiar spirit." Because apparently, competence required demonic assistance. The church didn't quite know what to do with them either. Celibacy was fine if it came with a habit and a vow. But if you were just unmarried for your own reasons, it looked like rebellion. Unsupervised women were theological headaches. They didn't fit the Virgin Mary model, nor the dutiful wife model. They were floating in the gray space in between, self-contained, unfocused, and quietly content. And that made people uneasy. In rural areas, some unmarried women took care of aging parents or orphan nieces and nephews. Others became herbalists, healers, or local midwives. That gave them influence, but it also made them convenient scapegoats. If a child got sick or a cow stopped giving milk, everyone suddenly remembered that the old woman down the road had once frowned in that direction. And just like that, the spinster became the witch's younger sister, both unmarried, both independent, both unervingly free. Not all spinsters lived in poverty. Some inherited small properties or savings. In towns, it wasn't uncommon for older single women to rent out rooms, own furniture, or keep a servant or two. They weren't rolling in wealth, but they had something far more scandalous: autonomy. They could decide who came into their homes, who they spoke to, what they ate for dinner, all without a husband's permission. To early modern society, that kind of freedom looked dangerously close to happiness. A few even appeared in wills and court records as lenders, women who quietly loaned money to neighbors or shopkeepers. They charged interest, kept ledgers, and managed repayments. Imagine the local gossip. Did you hear? Mistress and lent money to the miller again. The implication wasn't moral corruption, it was something worse: competence. In some regions, unmarried women formed guild-like groups for mutual support. They'd gather for festivals, light candles for each other's funerals, and sometimes pool resources for housing. Think of it as the medieval version of a co-op apartment, minus the plumbing. They weren't waiting for husbands to rescue them. They were quietly building networks that made men redundant, which was precisely the problem. By the 17th century, as marriage became increasingly tied to property and social stability, the unmarried woman became a threat to the narrative. If too many women decided they didn't need husbands, the whole structure wobbled. Who would raise the heirs? Who would cook the stews? Who would absorb the frustration of landless younger sons? It was unthinkable. So, society doubled down on ridicule. Plays and pamphlets mocked spinsters as shrill, ugly, or delusional. Their singleness became a moral failing. Even the word maid began to carry a sting. Yet, if you look closely at parish records, many of these women outlived their married peers. They had fewer children, which meant fewer deaths in childbirth. They had fewer debts, because there was no husband gambling away the savings. And they often died owning modest but solid estates: a chest, a bed, maybe a cow. Not glamorous, but peaceful. And perhaps peace was their quiet rebellion all along. There's something deeply ironic about it. The women history tried to erase as unimportant were often the ones who kept the entire domestic economy running. They spun the thread. They made the clothes. They fed the sick and taught the children. They lived simply, worked endlessly, and went largely unacknowledged. But their independence, however small, planted a seed: the idea that a woman could exist without belonging to anyone. Let's glide now to another peculiar corner of the past, not the working spinsters, but the ones who chose solitude for spiritual reasons. The women who built their independence behind stone walls, under vows, and in silence. Because while society fretted about single women outside convents, it found a strange sort of comfort in the ones locked inside. Chapter 6: The Anchorite Stone Cell. There's quiet, and then there's anchorite quiet. Imagine choosing to spend the rest of your life sealed into a stone room, voluntarily, and calling it spiritual fulfillment. That's the life of a medieval anchorite, or anchoress if female. The medieval world produced many oddities, but few were quite as committed to solitude as these women. Let's settle into this one slowly. Picture a small church, somewhere in 13th century England. Attached to its side is a narrow cell, stone walls, one window to the altar, and maybe another tiny slit to the outside world. Once a woman took her vows as an anchoress, she was symbolically buried. A funeral mass was held. The priest sprinkled dirt on her as she stepped inside the cell. And then the door was sealed. She would live there and die there. Why would anyone choose this? Partly devotion, partly practicality. For some women, it was an escape from the expectations of marriage and motherhood. For others, it was an intense religious calling. In either case, it was a path to independence, one of the few society actually respected. Because if a woman locked herself away for God, she was pious. If she did the same for herself, she was mad. The most famous anchoress, of course, was Julian of Norwich. Born around 1342, she became an anchoress at St. Julian's Church, hence the name, conveniently. Julian lived through the Black Death, the Peasants' Revolt, and an endless stream of royal disasters. And yet, from her small cell, she wrote one of the most hopeful works of medieval theology, Revelations of Divine Love. It's the source of that famous line, "All shall be well, and all shall be well, and all manner of things shall be well." A comforting sentence, written by someone who had literally buried herself alive. Julian's life was paradoxically visible and invisible. Her cell had a window into the church so she could receive communion, and another small opening to the street where people came for advice. She became a sort of spiritual therapist, part saint, part local counselor. People brought food, letters, and questions through the little window. In a world of noise and plague, her silence was a kind of wisdom. Ironically, her complete withdrawal from the world made her a cornerstone of it. And she wasn't alone. There were hundreds of women like her across medieval Europe. England alone had over 200 recorded anchoritic cells. Some were attached to parish churches, others to monasteries. Each had the same sparse setup: a tiny oratory, a bed, a crucifix, and a prayer book. Meals were passed through a hatch. Waste was somehow managed. Privacy was absolute. And yet, despite the isolation, many anchoresses became local celebrities. The church both admired and micromanaged them. There were instruction manuals, yes, literal how-to guides, for how to live walled up properly. The Ancrine Wis, written in the early 13th century, advised anchoresses to avoid gossip through the window, to dress plainly, and to eat modestly. It was essentially the medieval version of stay hydrated and don't check your messages too much. The church feared that anchoresses might become too popular, too influential, or, heaven forbid, too opinionated. Yet for some women, this was liberation disguised as confinement. Inside the cell, they answered to no husband, no father, no confessor hovering over every decision. Their lives were devoted to prayer, yes, but also to reading and writing, rare privileges for women of the time. They corresponded with priests and nobles, offered spiritual advice, and occasionally criticized the church itself from behind the safety of their walls. When you can't leave your cell, apparently you become very bold with your pen. Not all anchoritic experiences were so serene, of course. Some anchoresses faced neglect. If their patrons died or lost interest, they risked starvation. Others were accused of pride, because even holy women couldn't escape the medieval suspicion of female independence. The line between saint and scandal was thin. Too austere and you were admired. Too outspoken and you were dangerous. In some places, anchoresses shared their small buildings with a maid or assistant, someone who brought food, cleaned, and acted as a link to the outside world. Imagine that job, spending years caring for a woman who refused to step outside. It must have been equal parts fascinating and claustrophobic. The maid got to witness a living saint, and probably listened to a lot of very slow conversations about divine love. Still, there's something hauntingly beautiful about it all. These women turned isolation into a statement. When the world offered them marriage, childbirth, and domestic servitude, they said, "No, thank you, I'll have a wall instead." And somehow, behind those walls, they found a voice strong enough to echo for centuries. Julian wasn't the only one to write. There was also Marjorie Kemp. Though technically she wasn't an anchoress, she was just unbearably talkative about her visions. But Marjorie did visit Julian, seeking spiritual advice. Imagine the contrast: Marjorie, loud and weeping, recounting her divine revelations; Julian, calm and contained, listening through a narrow window. Two extremes of female spirituality, one walled in, the other roaming free, both trying to carve a space for women's faith in a man's church. In a way, The anchoritic life is the ultimate metaphor for medieval womanhood. A tiny space where you're both protected and confined. Your safety guaranteed only by your isolation. Freedom granted through surrender. It's bleak, yes, but also oddly empowering. Within those walls, an anchoress could write, think, and speak with authority no ordinary woman could claim. She might be physically trapped, but intellectually, she was untouchable. As centuries passed, the practice faded. By the Reformation, anchoritic cells were demolished, and the few remaining anchoresses were quietly forgotten. Some were reabsorbed into convents, others simply disappeared from the records. Their names linger only in old parish rolls. Dame Alice, anchoress of St. Peter's, Margaret enclosed at All Saints. Small footnotes in stone. Yet their legacy is deeper than it looks. In a society that feared women living alone, these women made solitude sacred. They turned a life without men into something holy. And while they probably didn't think of themselves as rebels, they were quietly, gently behind stone walls. Let's drift, then, from these walled-in saints to another group of women who found independence not in silence but in service, the nuns and convent sisters. Because while anchoresses built their solitude out of stone, the convent built it out of community. Chapter 7. The Convent's Secret Autonomy. If the anchoress's stone cell was solitude distilled to its purest form, then the medieval convent was solitude's more sociable cousin, a quiet house full of women who had, in their own way, opted out of the world. To outsiders, it looked like pure devotion. Inside, it was often something far more practical: safety, education, and a carefully managed form of freedom. Let's ease into this softly. Picture the cloisters, long stone corridors open to a square garden, the sound of sandals on flagstones, the slow rhythm of bells marking time. Morning prayers, meals in silence, reading, work, and evening chants. The schedule never changed. The world outside was noisy and unpredictable, but inside the convent walls, everything flowed like clockwork. That predictability, that quiet control, was part of the appeal. For many women, joining a convent wasn't simply about piety. It was about options. If your father couldn't afford a dowry big enough to marry you off, sending you to a convent was the next best thing. It kept you respectable, fed, and out of scandal. And in a society where the only respectable female roles were wife, widow, or nun, it was the only door left open that didn't lead to someone's kitchen. But here's the funny thing. Once behind those walls, many nuns found more independence than they ever could have in marriage. They managed estates, ran schools, copied manuscripts, and corresponded with nobles and popes. They controlled land, money, and time, three things medieval women rarely touched. A nun might technically be married to Christ, but in practice, she was more likely to be managing vineyards and negotiating with bishops than floating in mystical bliss. Take, for example, Hildegard of Bingen, the 12th century Benedictine abbess, composer, writer, and all-around overachiever. She claimed her visions came straight from God, which conveniently made men hesitate to interrupt her. Hildegard ran her own convent, wrote books on medicine and theology, composed ethereal music, and even scolded emperors when they annoyed her. She was, essentially, the CEO of a spiritual corporation. And like any good executive, she knew how to manage her image. Visions were her brand. They legitimized her authority in a world that didn't like women having any. Her letters still survive. Confident, commanding, and just a little bit passive-aggressive. When one male cleric refused to listen to her advice, she simply reminded him that a woman, weak though she is, has been chosen to deliver God's word when men have failed. That's medieval speak for, sit down and take notes. But not every convent was led by a Hildegard. Most were quieter, more domestic, and yet still quietly subversive. In places like France and the Low Countries, convents ran their own economies. They produced textiles, sold manuscripts, and even brewed beer. Yes, holy women were among Europe's first master brewers. If you've ever enjoyed a monastery ale, you can thank the women who perfected the art centuries earlier, though they were written out of the story when the industry turned profitable. Inside those cloistered communities, hierarchies mirrored the outside world. Abbess at the top, then prioress, choir nuns, lay sisters, and servants. But within those ranks, women could rise by skill or intellect, not birth or beauty. It was a meritocracy in miniature. Again, something that didn't exist in most of medieval Europe. And then there was the education. Convents were centers of female literacy. Girls sent there as boarders often learned to read and write, sing, embroider, and manage accounts. Some left to marry, others stayed. Either way, they carried with them a sense of structure and self-possession uncommon outside those walls. Even kings sent their daughters to convents for safekeeping, and occasionally regretted it when those daughters developed opinions. The convent was supposed to tame women's independence, but ironically, it often refined it. Behind the discipline and vows of obedience, there was room for intellect, creativity, and quiet dissent. Some nuns wrote poetry. Some painted. Some staged tiny rebellions, eating forbidden foods, keeping pet cats, or sneaking letters to outsiders. Nothing earth-shattering, but in a world obsessed with female silence, even a letter was an act of resistance. Of course, not all convents were idyllic havens. Some were overcrowded, underfunded, and filled with unwilling occupants. Many noble families dumped their extra daughters there, the ones without suitable marriage prospects. These girls didn't always take it gracefully. Records from certain German convents mention nuns who secretly hoarded jewelry, read romance novels, or complained that the bread was too coarse. Essentially, they were the medieval equivalent of boarding school rebels. And then there were the abbesses who ruled their communities like minor monarchs. Abbess Eleanor of Shaftesbury, for instance, controlled large estates in 13th century England and managed tenants, rents, and church appointments. Her signature appeared on legal documents, an unthinkable power for a laywoman. She may have worn a veil, but make no mistake, she was a landlord first, nun second. The church tolerated this power because convents served a purpose. They absorbed surplus noblewomen, projected piety, and offered spiritual labor at a discount. But whenever a convent became too wealthy or influential, male clergy intervened. Visitations were arranged. Rules were rewritten. Abbesses were retired. It was a constant tug-of-war between female autonomy and ecclesiastical control. Still, the convent's walls provided a shelter from the social storm outside. For a woman who wanted to read, think, or simply be, it was safer to be a nun than a wife. Inside, your silence was holy. Outside, it was obedience. The same action, two entirely different meanings depending on who owned you. Convents also offered one subtle but profound freedom, the ability to age without fear. Married women grew old at their husband's mercy, widows at their sons'. Nuns grew old together, a community of women who knew one another's habits, tempers, and prayers. They weren't property. They were part of a system that, for all its constraints, was theirs. And so, as bells tolled across Europe, each convent echoed a small, quiet form of rebellion, the sound of women living collectively, thinking privately, and existing outside the reach of men. But not every woman found peace in cloisters or stone cells. Some stayed in the world, working, trading, surviving, under labels that ranged from merchant to sinful. And in the cities and markets of the late Middle Ages, a new kind of independent woman emerged, the businesswoman. Let's drift gently toward her story next, the one society never quite managed to erase, no matter how hard it tried. Chapter 8: The Merchant Widow and the Market Women. By the time the church bells faded over the convent walls and into the humming streets of medieval towns, another sound took over, the chatter of the market. Barter, laughter, haggling, gossip. The clatter of carts over cobblestone, the hiss of roasting meat, and the sharp calls of women selling fish, cloth, or bread. Welcome to the beating heart of medieval urban life. And, despite what the history books used to say, a space where women were everywhere. You wouldn't think it from reading official records, which, of course, were written by men who only noticed women when they caused trouble. But walk through a town like Bruges, York, or Lübeck around 1350, and you'd see it plainly, women working in nearly every trade imaginable. Brewers, bakers, spinners, weavers, moneylenders, innkeepers, candlemakers, laundresses, and sellers of, well, everything from fish to fine silk. They weren't exceptions. They were the economy. Let's start with the merchant widow, one of the most quietly powerful figures in medieval cities. When a merchant died, his wife didn't just inherit his grief. She often inherited his shop, his trade contacts, and his debts. And rather than remarry, which would transfer everything to another man, many widows chose to run the business themselves. This was perfectly legal, by the way. Guild records in places like Paris and London list widows as mistresses of their craft, allowed to employ apprentices, trade goods, and sign contracts. Sometimes they ran the shop better than their late husbands ever did. In a world that claimed women were too emotional for logic, these widows were quietly balancing accounts and negotiating with Italian bankers. There's a particularly good story from 14th century Cologne about a widow named Greta, who ran her late husband's wine business. She became so respected for her fair dealing that merchants from the Rhineland started referring to her cellar simply as Greta's house. When a local guild tried to push her out, because heaven forbid a woman manage barrels of fermented grapes, she fought them in court and won. Her argument was simple: my husband's trade is my inheritance. And she was right. Now, not every working woman was a Greta. Most were what we'd now call micro-entrepreneurs. A fishwife selling from a basket, a spinner bringing her thread to the cloth hall, a brewer making ale in her kitchen. But together, they kept the urban economy alive. And yes, alewives deserve a moment of spotlight, if only because they're some of the most slandered figures in medieval history. Before beer became a male-dominated trade, brewing was women's work. It fit neatly into household rhythms. Mash the grains, boil the wort, let it ferment while you tend to the garden. Ale was food, medicine, and income all at once. But as demand rose and profits followed, men began muscling in. By the 15th century, the once common sight of a woman selling ale from her door was replaced by guild-run breweries, and women were quietly pushed out. To make the process easier, the Male Brewers Guild spread rumors that alewives were greedy, dishonest, and possibly in league with the devil. Yes, that devil. You can practically see the propaganda forming the roots of the later witch stereotype: the cauldron, the broom, the cat, the mysterious bubbling liquid. It wasn't magic. It was beer. Then there were the laundresses, who occupied a strange middle ground in social status. They handled the clothes of nobles and clergy, literally washing the filth of the elite, yet they were often treated as suspect. They worked near rivers, where men claimed they gathered to gossip or sin. Still, those same men depended on them to keep tunics white and linens clean. Hypocrisy was another medieval specialty. In marketplaces, women had their own informal networks. They lent one another money, shared stall space, and watched each other's goods during church hours. Some became local fixtures, trusted voices of the street. A few even grew wealthy. In the 13th century, a London woman named Alice at Kai made enough selling cloth to loan money to minor nobles. When she died, her will listed apprentices, stock, and outstanding debts owed to her. She wasn't unique. She was just well documented. And then there's the merchant couple, the medieval version of a small business partnership. A wife's work was often invisible in the records but crucial behind the counter. She weighed goods, tallied accounts, and managed customers. When her husband traveled for trade, which could take months, she ran everything. Letters from Italian merchants to their wives survive, full of business updates and loving instructions. Sell the pepper at a good price, but not before Wednesday. Pay the rent, and please don't forget the mule. It's oddly domestic and corporate all at once. But as towns grew richer, guilds tightened their control. Crafts that had once welcomed women, weaving, dyeing, baking, gradually restricted membership to men. The rhetoric was always the same: for quality control. Translation: for profit and power. By the 15th century, many women found themselves pushed out of trades their grandmothers had dominated. And yet they adapted. They turned to work that escaped guild oversight: embroidery, nursing, midwifery, or unlicensed tavern keeping. All technically unofficial, yet vital to daily life. The economy of women's labor slipped underground but never disappeared. What's striking, reading through city records, is how pragmatic these women were. They didn't call themselves feminists or rebels. They just did what had to be done. Feed the family, pay the rent, survive the plague, restock the stall. It wasn't glamorous, but it was power, the quiet kind that sustains everything else. And the church noticed. Sermons began warning against idle women, talkative market wives, disobedient widows, which is medieval code for women who earn their own money and don't need us. One preacher in 15th century Paris complained that women spent too much time in markets and not enough in prayer. Another warned that widows grow proud when left ungoverned. Of course they did. No one likes discovering that the people you dismissed as weak are doing just fine without you. As cities flourished and the late Middle Ages slid toward the early modern world, these market women and merchant widows kept the gears turning. They were the backbone of urban stability, though history would later forget their names, preferring knights, kings, and explorers. But while cities thrived, Europe's countryside remained a place of relentless labor, fields, thatch, mud, and unending obligation. And in those villages, a different kind of woman's life unfolded, one rooted in toil, community, and a complicated relationship with the land. We'll head there next, because to understand medieval women, truly understand them, we have to leave the stone walls and cobblestones behind and walk barefoot into the fields. Chapter 9. Peasant Women and the Weight of the Seasons. If medieval cities were the restless pulse of trade and gossip, the countryside was the slow, steady heartbeat that kept everything alive. Most women didn't live behind guild walls or cathedral shadows. They lived on the land, in cottages that smelled faintly of smoke and cabbage, where survival was measured not in gold coins, but in sacks of grain and the favor of the weather. Let's start there, in the fields, where the dawn came too early and the work never really stopped. A peasant woman's year wasn't a calendar so much as a cycle. Plowing, planting, weeding, harvesting, threshing. Feeding livestock, spinning wool, baking bread, mending clothes. By the time one season ended, another had already begun demanding something. And through it all, she balanced the unglamorous mathematics of rural life. How much to save, how much to sell, how much to stretch through the hungry months. Marriage was less a romance and more a labor contract. A man needed a partner to keep the household running. A woman needed security and land access. Love sometimes happened, but it wasn't the point. You could call it pragmatic or depressing, depending on your level of caffeine. In many villages, women worked beside men from dawn to dusk. They helped sow grain, tend sheep, and harvest crops. They were not, despite later myths, confined to the home. The home was the field, the barn, the bakehouse, the spinning bench, all of it woven into one endless workspace. A woman's hands were her resume, calloused, stained, scarred, proof of competence. No one cared if you could embroider a delicate pattern. What mattered was whether you could gut a fish, patch a roof, or turn goat milk into cheese before it spoiled. There was a brutal equality to it all. Life was hard enough that everyone had to work, regardless of gender. But that didn't mean equality in rights or respect. Men held the legal reins, property, inheritance, contracts. Women held the invisible ones, food, children, and the household's survival. It's easy to romanticize rural life now, the thatched roofs, the rustic charm, the wildflowers. But step closer, and the reality smells of sweat, smoke, and damp straw. You'd sleep beside your family, maybe a few chickens, under a roof that leaked every other storm. And if you were lucky, you'd make it to winter with enough grain to avoid famine. That's not to say these women were miserable all the time. They had festivals, community bonds, laughter around the hearth. But theirs was a humor born of exhaustion, a sort of laugh or you'll cry, resilience that's older than any king's crown. In the early Middle Ages, peasants owed labor to their lords, the infamous corvée. That meant a woman might spend half her week tending her family's plot, and the other half working the manor's land for free. And when she came home, she still had to cook, clean, and nurse whoever had gotten sick, which, statistically, was someone. The church liked to paint rural women as either saints or sinners, either the patient wife or the lustful temptress. In reality, most were simply tired. They prayed when they could, sinned when they must, and hoped no one noticed either. Childbirth, of course, was constant. Without reliable contraception, most women gave birth again and again, sometimes a dozen times or more. Midwives helped, though they were rarely celebrated. Their work was sacred and risky, and yet, in official church doctrine, often treated with suspicion. You'd think people would be more grateful to the person keeping the next generation alive, but no, superstition always wins over logic. Some peasant women gained a fragile sort of autonomy as widows. If their husbands died and left behind a plot of land, they might manage it themselves, until a male relative or remarriage shifted control again. A few never remarried, choosing to live independently. In small communities, that made them both respected and slightly feared. People whispered that such women knew things. And yes, they probably did. How to survive, how to heal, how to stretch a sack of grain 2 weeks longer than anyone else. When the Black Death hit in the 14th century, everything changed, at least temporarily. So many people died that labor became scarce, and peasants suddenly found their work in demand. Wages rose. Women, too, benefited. With fewer hands to farm and fewer men to marry, widows and single women filled the gaps, managing land, trading goods, even hiring laborers. For a brief, surreal generation, the feudal hierarchy bent under the weight of survival. But, predictably, the upper classes didn't like that. Within decades, new laws tried to push everyone back into their place. Because history is basically one long tug-of-war between necessity and control. Even so, the rhythms of rural life endured, a quiet defiance against centuries of rule. You can trace it through the records. A woman fined for brewing ale without permission, another cited for collecting firewood from a noble's forest, another for selling eggs at an unauthorized market. Every fine, every infraction, was a glimpse of someone refusing to be erased. And yet, for all their invisibility, peasant women shaped the very culture of medieval Europe. They were the storytellers, the healers, the keepers of customs. They passed down songs, remedies, and folk wisdom, the kind that never made it into chronicles but lived in every village for centuries. If a noblewoman's life was gilded and restricted, a peasant woman's was raw and expansive. She didn't have silk gowns or fancy titles. But she had agency, the kind born from constant necessity. She knew the seasons better than any priest knew his psalms. She could read the weather in the wind, predict a birth by a woman's face, and tell the time of day by the way the chickens moved. That's not romantic. That's survival. And as the centuries turned, that survival shaped everything that came after. Because when the great plagues, famines, and wars ended, it wasn't kings who rebuilt the world. It was the women who never had time to stop working in the first place. Let's drift from the muddy fields now, towards something a little stranger, a space caught between faith and freedom. A place where women stepped outside both peasant life and marriage, but didn't quite become nuns either. They called themselves beguines. And they were some of the most quietly radical women in medieval Europe. Chapter 10. The beguines, women who chose neither marriage nor the convent. If peasant women carried the weight of the seasons, and nuns carried the weight of prayer, beguines carried something altogether more unusual: choice. Choice, in a medieval world that didn't really allow it. The beguines appeared in the 12th and 13th centuries, primarily in the Low Countries, modern-day Belgium and the Netherlands, but their influence spread across much of Northern Europe. They were women who lived together in semi-religious communities, devoted to prayer and charity, but without taking permanent vows. No husband, no lifelong monastic commitment, just a life of their own design. Picture a cluster of small houses along a cobblestone street, perhaps around a chapel, where dozens of women lived quietly together. They worked, prayed, taught, and cared for the sick. They made clothes, ran small shops, and managed money. Some were wealthy, some poor, all independent in ways society found uncomfortable. The church had a complicated relationship with them. On one hand, beguines were admired for devotion and service. On the other, they were not controlled. They answered to no abbess, no bishop, no husband. A network of autonomous women, operating outside male authority, that was unnerving. They did not follow a rigid schedule like convent nuns. Instead, they followed their own rhythms, balancing prayer, labor, and social work as they saw fit. And because there were no vows, they could leave or marry if they chose. That flexibility was both revolutionary and dangerous. Some church authorities feared it might tempt women into heresy. And yes, heresy did sometimes get attached to beguines, though often unfairly. Because the church's main problem wasn't theology, but control. Women who could live independently, teach, and influence others without male oversight were suspicious by default. Still, beguines flourished. In cities like Ghent, Bruges, and Liège, they provided essential services, caring for the sick, educating girls, spinning wool, tending to the poor. During plagues, wars, and famine, beguines were often the most reliable caregivers. Their independence allowed them to act decisively without waiting for a male authority to approve. Some beguines became famous. Mechthild of Magdeburg, for example, wrote The Flowing Light of the Godhead, a mystical work blending devotion and philosophy. Her writing was so radical at the time that church authorities debated whether to burn it, and yet, it survived, precisely because she wasn't a nun bound to a cloister. She had mobility, audience, and a voice, all from a woman's society assumed should be silent. Beguines often lived in small neighborhoods, called beguinages, which were sometimes walled for safety. They formed communities of support, allowing women to age without losing independence. Older beguines trained younger ones, passing on practical skills alongside spiritual knowledge. They were a quiet counterbalance to both convent life and marriage, an option for women who wanted autonomy without abandoning faith. Their work wasn't always celebrated. Critics accused them of idleness, greed, or secret sin. But the reality was much simpler. Beguines existed in the cracks of society. They worked hard, prayed, and lived independently. That, to some observers, looked unnatural. A woman not needing a husband or an abbess was, apparently, inherently suspect. Still, beguines managed to leave a legacy. Some became saints, some became scholars, and many simply became pillars of their local communities. Their model inspired other forms of female communal life in later centuries, even as the church tried to absorb or suppress them. What's remarkable is how beguines embodied a pattern we've seen again and again, women carving out lives for themselves wherever the world permitted it, even slightly. Widows, spinsters, nuns, peasant laborers, market women, and now beguines, each found niches of independence, however constrained. They were, in many ways, the true pioneers of female autonomy in a world determined to deny it. The beguines thrived for centuries, only gradually declining after the Reformation and the rise of more regulated convents. But during their peak, they proved something radical, that women could live apart from male authority, contribute meaningfully to society, and maintain their faith without surrendering control. And so, as we drift through the streets of medieval towns and the quiet halls of beguinages, it's clear that the story of women living alone without men is not one of isolation, but of resilience, ingenuity, and quiet power. Each choice, to remain unmarried, to spin, to pray, to care, to trade, was a form of rebellion in its own right. And though history often tried to erase them, the record whispers their existence to anyone patient enough to look. From here, we can float gently toward another category of women who lived on their own terms. Noble women without husbands, who wielded power, estates, and influence in a man's world. Because independence wasn't reserved for the humble or the religious. Even the highest-ranking women sometimes found ways to live without men controlling every aspect of their lives. Chapter 11. Noble women who ruled alone. When we think of medieval power, we often imagine kings and lords, men with swords, crowns, and an endless appetite for paperwork. But history quietly remembers women who managed lands, castles, and politics without a husband standing over them. These noble women were rare, yes, but they existed, and they often lived in a strange tension between authority and suspicion. Consider Eleanor of Aquitaine, one of the most famous examples. Born in 1122, she inherited vast lands in southwestern France, making her one of the wealthiest women in Europe. She married King Louis VII of France, then, after an annulment, King Henry II of England. But Eleanor's power didn't disappear even when her husbands were alive. She managed her estates with keen intelligence, negotiated treaties, and, famously, supported her sons in rebellion against their father, Henry II. Yes, that was risky. Yes, it was audacious. And yes, she got away with it. Mostly. Eleanor wasn't an exception in principle, though she was in scale. Across medieval Europe, widows often managed estates until their sons came of age. Some noble women remained unmarried by choice, preferring autonomy over the uncertainty of a politically motivated marriage. This autonomy often involved real power, commanding troops in minor conflicts, collecting rents, adjudicating disputes, and running the household economy, which, in noble terms, could be massive. Take Margaret of Anjou, Queen Consort of England in the 15th century. Though married, she effectively ruled as regent for her son, Henry VI, during a period of civil war. She negotiated with lords, raised armies, and shaped the political landscape, all while society whispered that a woman shouldn't touch such responsibilities. She was vilified in later histories, often portrayed as scheming or hysterical, because a woman exercising power made chroniclers uncomfortable. Even noble women without the glamour of queenship wielded influence quietly. A widow controlling her late husband's lands had legal authority. She could sell property, lend money, and enter contracts. This authority sometimes extended to overseeing serfs and managing agricultural production. To peasants, a widowed lady was the boss. To her neighbors, she was a curiosity. To male rivals, she was dangerous. Many noblewomen cultivated networks of alliances through correspondence, patronage, and marriage negotiations, even if they themselves never remarried. Letters reveal women advising each other on political strategy, mediating disputes, and sometimes openly challenging male authority. The written word became a tool of power. If a sword was out of reach, a quill could do almost as well. Some noble women were forced into independence by circumstance. A husband might die in battle, or a marriage might fail, or children might be too young to inherit. Others embraced independence as a conscious choice. In every case, their lives highlight a recurring theme. Autonomy is never granted freely, but it can be claimed. Then there were women like Isabella of Castile, who ruled in her own right. Though married to Ferdinand of Aragon, Isabella retained control over her territories and resources, ensuring that she was never just a figurehead. She issued laws, managed finances, and directed military campaigns. Her authority was both respected and resented. And, of course, she was instrumental in sponsoring overseas exploration, shaping the course of European history while still balancing the expectations placed upon a woman of her station. Noble women sometimes cultivated the same quiet power as merchant widows or beguines, but on a larger scale. They managed households, estates, and diplomacy with remarkable skill. Yet, like all women who lived alone or independently, they were constantly under scrutiny. Chroniclers recorded their deeds but often framed them in moral or emotional terms: ambitious, headstrong, or manipulative. Rarely neutral. Rarely simply competent. Independence for noble women also had social costs. A single or widowed noblewoman without a husband could be vulnerable to predatory nobles or political rivals. Guardianships were arranged, often reluctantly. Marriages could be forced to consolidate power or alliances. And yet, despite these pressures, some women carved out decades of real autonomy. It's worth noting that autonomy was often more visible for the upper classes. A peasant or merchant widow wielded influence locally. A noblewoman's influence could extend across counties or kingdoms. But the pattern was the same. Women created spaces for themselves wherever they could, navigating societal expectations with a combination of cunning, labor, and quiet defiance. As we reflect on these noble women, it becomes clear that independence in medieval Europe was rarely simple or safe. It was earned, defended, and constantly negotiated. Whether behind stone walls, in cloisters, at market stalls, or managing estates, women who lived alone without men often carried a subtle, pervasive power that shaped daily life, economies, and even kingdoms. From here, we can drift into the lives of a slightly different group, women who found solitude not through social position or wealth, but through personality and circumstance. The widows and unmarried women of culture, art, and intellect. Because independence isn't always about law or land. Sometimes, it's about thought, expression, and the quiet refusal to be defined by men. Chapter 12. Widows, Scholars, and the Women of Quiet Genius. Not all women sought independence through walls, markets, or estates. Some found it through thought, letters, and a refusal to bow to the expectation that their minds should be silent. This chapter drifts gently into the quieter corners of medieval Europe, where widows, scholars, and intellectually curious women carved niches for themselves, often unnoticed by the men chronicling history. Take Christine de Pizan, born in 1364 in Venice but living most of her life in Paris. Her father was a scholar, her husband a courtier. By the age of 25, she was widowed with children to raise. Rather than succumb to the limited options society offered, remarriage or convent life, Christine turned to writing. She supported her family through her pen, producing poetry, political treatises, and moral philosophy. She became one of Europe's first professional female writers. And in doing so, she defied the assumption that women existed solely in relation to men. Christine wrote about women's roles, often challenging conventional wisdom. She argued that education and virtue mattered more than noble birth or beauty. She questioned men's tendency to blame women for societal ills, emphasizing fairness, reason, and agency. Her works circulated widely, influencing both contemporaries and later humanists. She wasn't cloistered or married off. She simply claimed the space society had tried to deny her. Other widows pursued scholarship less visibly, often in Latin manuscripts tucked away in libraries or private studies. Some were patrons of learning, commissioning books, copying texts, or translating works from Greek or Arabic. Their households became centers of intellectual activity, subtly shaping cultural and scientific discourse. Widows had time, unusual freedom, and could devote themselves to learning without interruption from husbands or in-laws. Then there were women who cultivated expertise in medicine. Some worked as herbalists or healers, passing knowledge across generations. Their expertise could rival male physicians, though it was rarely recognized officially. A woman treating wounds or delivering children might be respected locally, feared professionally, and dismissed in formal records, all at the same time. Education, creativity, and intellectual work became forms of independence that did not rely on social status or wealth. Women like Christine demonstrated that autonomy could exist purely in thought, expression, and the ability to influence others without wielding land or gold. Their work was quiet but enduring, whispers of autonomy that survived centuries. Interestingly, widows often had more freedom than single or married women. A widow controlled her household, could manage property, and sometimes engage in trade. She could attend intellectual salons or host discussions, becoming a figure of authority within her local sphere. Her independence was temporary, of course. Legal guardianship or social pressures could curtail it, but for many, it was a rare opportunity to exercise full agency. These women remind us that independence in medieval Europe took many forms. It wasn't always dramatic or visible. Sometimes it was the ability to read, write, heal, or simply exist without a man dictating your every move. Their genius was quiet because survival demanded subtlety. But subtlety does not diminish impact. Christine de Pizan's words, the manuscripts copied by anonymous women, the herbs and remedies preserved in village kitchens, all testify to women quietly shaping their world. And of course, independence could take even stranger forms. Some women, either by temperament or circumstance, avoided society entirely. They lived alone, traveling or renting small rooms, rarely marrying or forming formal alliances. Their lives were precarious, but often they were freer than most. A single woman navigating a city or village on her own faced risk, yes, but also autonomy, something society reluctantly acknowledged when her work or survival demanded it. Across Europe, from castles to city streets to secluded studies, these women shared a common thread: the refusal to let male authority define the limits of their lives. They survived plagues, wars, social restrictions, and constant scrutiny. Yet they created spaces for intellect, commerce, care, and creativity. As we drift toward the next chapter, we'll move into something slightly darker but still gentle in its pacing: women whose independence was tied to secrecy, rumor, and social suspicion. The spinsters, the old maids, and the socially unconventional, those who lived alone and therefore became the subject of speculation and folklore. Because independence, even in medieval Europe, was rarely invisible. Chapter 13: Spinsters, Rumor, and the Folklore of Solitude. By now, we've wandered through convents, marketplaces, noble estates, and quiet studies. But let's settle into a different corner of medieval society, the world of women who lived alone not by wealth, piety, or choice of vocation, but simply because they never married. These were the spinsters, the women who survived on their own, who often carried the weight of rumor and social suspicion as carefully as they carried their baskets or manuscripts. A spinster in medieval Europe was far more than a label for a woman without a husband. It was a social designation loaded with assumptions: that she had missed her chance, that she was undesirable, or that she was somehow failing in her natural role. Of course, these assumptions ignored reality. Some women never married because they were widows. Some chose work, independence, or religious devotion over a match. Some simply survived in a harsh world where life was unpredictable. In towns and villages, spinsters often became the caretakers, the household managers, or the substitute mothers for nieces and nephews. They ran small businesses, brewed ale, or managed rental properties. And yet, despite their contributions, folklore cast them in shades of suspicion. You may have heard echoes of this in fairy tales: the old maid with the sharp tongue, the mysterious woman who lives alone, the neighbor who knows too much. In medieval legend, the spinster's solitude was often read as unnatural. If a woman didn't marry, it was whispered she was proud, greedy, or perhaps in league with darker forces. These rumors were, in part, fear of autonomy. A woman who could live alone, manage her affairs, and persist without a man challenge society's assumptions. But not all spinsters were feared. Some were respected: wise women, herbalists, teachers, or midwives who wielded knowledge that the broader community relied upon. A village might grumble, but they came when her skill was needed. She was tolerated, cautiously admired, or quietly indispensable. Her independence made her both vulnerable and powerful. Some spinsters lived near churches, attending mass, helping with charity, and sometimes serving as scribes or tutors. Others rented small rooms in towns or villages, quietly making a living from craft, trade, or hospitality. And while their lives were often lonely, they were also remarkably self-determined. They navigated a world that expected dependence, finding workarounds, alliances, and quiet strategies to survive and thrive. Interestingly, their perceived danger to society often reflected the same anxieties that troubled church authorities and male chroniclers about beguines, widows, and other independent women. Solitude was threatening because it implied choice. A woman who could live alone without supervision or obligation was, in essence, saying, "I do not need you." And that assertion, however silent, was revolutionary. Folklore often exaggerates. Stories of spinsters as witches, fortune-tellers, or misers were less about magic and more about society's discomfort with women outside expected roles. Yet beneath these tales are traces of real lives: women managing homes, raising children, producing goods, offering advice, or healing illness, all quietly exercising agency that history sometimes failed to record. Spinsters often created informal networks, much like beguines or market women. Neighbors, other single women, or apprentices might form support systems, sharing knowledge, resources, and company. These networks, rarely documented, formed the invisible infrastructure that allowed women to maintain independence in a world structured against them. So, what did it mean to be a spinster? It was a precarious life, yes, with social judgment, occasional isolation, and daily labor. But it was also a life of agency, adaptability, and subtle influence. Women who lived alone without men, for whatever reason, were surviving against the odds, shaping communities, and quietly challenging expectations. As we drift toward the next chapter, we will explore the lives of women who lived even further outside convention. Wandering women, traveling merchants, and itinerant healers, those who carried their independence literally on their backs, moving through a world structured for men. Chapter 14. The Wandering Women of Medieval Europe. Beyond the fields, markets, convents, and towns, some women embraced a different kind of independence altogether, the wandering life. These were women who traveled alone or in small groups, carrying their work, their homes, and their lives with them. They were merchants, performers, healers, or simply survivors who refused to be tied to a single hearth or landlord. Travel in medieval Europe was never easy. Roads were rough, inns were scarce, and the world outside the walls could be dangerous. Yet for some women, movement offered a kind of freedom that staying in one place could never provide. A wandering woman could choose where to work, whom to trade with, and when to rest. She could avoid obligations to husbands, fathers, or lords. It was independence at its rawest, and also its most precarious. Consider the female merchant who moved between towns, selling cloth, spices, or small household items. She often traveled with a pack or cart, sometimes with companions, sometimes alone. Her reputation preceded her. Trusted merchants became known in multiple towns, their word as valuable as any coin. A traveling merchant had to negotiate constantly with local authorities, male competitors, and other traders. Her autonomy depended entirely on skill, wit, and a little luck. Other wandering women found independence through craft or performance. Minstrels, entertainers, and musicians could move from village to village, selling their art while avoiding the constraints of permanent residence. They often joined traveling groups, forming small communities that were more chosen family than kin. These women could write, sing, or play instruments, and be compensated for it. In some ways, they were the precursors to modern freelancers, paid for their skills, untethered to a single employer. Then there were the itinerant healers, often mislabeled as witches or wise women. They traveled to provide remedies, deliver babies, or advise on illnesses. Their work was vital, yet precarious. Success depended on community trust, and a single accusation could ruin them. These women cultivated networks of clients, allies, and sometimes fellow healers, moving strategically to maintain safety and livelihood. Wandering was not merely practical, it was also social. Many women who traveled carried news, stories, and cultural knowledge between regions. They were conduits of ideas, recipes, remedies, and gossip, the unofficial information networks of medieval Europe. A town that welcomed a wandering woman might gain access to a broader world than its walls could provide. Yet society remained ambivalent. Church authorities often regarded wandering women with suspicion, equating mobility with sin or deceit. Men in positions of power viewed independent movement as dangerous. And still, women found ways to thrive. They used charm, wit, skill, and discretion to navigate spaces where others might fail. Interestingly, some women combined wandering with more traditional forms of work. A widow might maintain a small stall in one town but travel seasonally to another market, selling the same goods in multiple locations. A beguine, if exiled or seeking opportunities, might carry her craft to a neighboring town, blending piety with practical survival. In this way, movement itself became a form of independence, mobility as agency. The wandering life was not easy, nor was it glamorous. It required constant vigilance, negotiation, and resilience. Yet for women who could master it, it offered a rare freedom to live outside the direct control of men, outside the constraints of inheritance, marriage, or convent. These women remind us that medieval independence took many forms. It was not just wealth, land, or religious devotion. It could be mobility, skill, or the quiet refusal to settle. By moving through a world designed to contain them, wandering women claimed spaces, temporal, social, and geographic, that society never intended for them. From here, we can gently drift to another group of women whose lives were shaped less by travel and more by marginal social status: unmarried, childless, or otherwise on the edges of medieval norms. These were the women whose independence was defined not by wealth or vocation, but by circumstance. The socially peripheral women, quietly navigating a world that often wished them invisible. Chapter 15. Marginal Women and the Quiet Edges of Society. As the streets of towns and the open roads fade behind us, we drift toward the edges, not of geography, but of society itself. Here lived women whose lives were defined by circumstance rather than choice. The unmarried, the childless, the socially peripheral. They were neither nuns nor beguines, neither merchant widows nor wandering healers. Yet they found ways to navigate a world that often tried to ignore or constrain them. Marginal women occupied spaces that were both vulnerable and surprisingly autonomous. Without husbands, they lacked legal protection. Without children, they had no direct claim to inheritance or family power. And yet, many survived, supported themselves, and even influenced the communities around them. They did so quietly, often invisibly, through labor, networks, and subtle forms of authority. Consider the single women who worked as household servants or domestic laborers. They were employed in other people's homes, cooking, cleaning, and caring for children. Their work was essential, yet socially precarious. A single accusation could threaten reputation, and opportunities for advancement were limited. Still, the autonomy they held within their labor was real. They could negotiate hours, wages, and sometimes even living arrangements, gaining small pockets of self-determination. Then there were women who took in lodgers, ran small shops, or provided crafts and services in the local market. Even without formal status, they could influence local economies. A woman with skill in weaving, spinning, or baking might be indispensable to a village. And in towns, women could sometimes leverage their networks of friends, neighbors, and clients to ensure survival and modest prosperity. Marginal women were often at the center of social knowledge. They knew who was married, who was expecting, who owed what to whom. Gossip, in these cases, was not idle chatter but a form of information that carried power. To be socially peripheral was, paradoxically, to occupy a kind of discrete authority, an invisible thread linking the community together. Of course, suspicion followed these women. Childless spinsters were sometimes labeled as witches, meddlesome, or morally suspect. Widows without adult sons or powerful family connections were viewed with wariness. And yet, many of these women had strategies for survival. They maintained friendships, offered help when it was needed, and cultivated skills that made them valuable even when society treated them as outsiders. Religious life provided another subtle option. Some marginal women devoted themselves to prayer or charity without entering formal convents. They might serve in hospitals, care for the poor, or assist with sick neighbors. By combining service with independence, they carved spaces in which their lives had meaning and influence. Education, where available, also offered opportunities. Some marginal women learned to read, write, or perform basic arithmetic. Literacy allowed correspondence, record-keeping, and participation in small-scale trade. Even without wealth, land, or family backing, knowledge provided a subtle form of autonomy. Across Europe, these women represent the persistence of agency under constraint. Their independence was never absolute, yet it was significant. They adapted to the rhythms of society, claimed niches where possible, and negotiated daily life with resilience. They were neither celebrated nor notorious, often overlooked in official chronicles, yet they sustained families, communities, and economies through sheer persistence. The quiet power of marginal women reminds us that independence in medieval Europe was rarely about grandeur. It was about survival, adaptability, and the subtle assertion of self in a world structured to limit choice. They were neighbors, workers, caregivers, and keepers of knowledge, roles that, while invisible in history's grand narratives, were essential to society's functioning. From here, we can move toward a reflection on the cumulative impact of these women, from anchoresses to spinsters, beguines to wandering merchants, and consider the patterns of autonomy, resilience, and quiet defiance that emerge across centuries of medieval Europe. Because understanding the lived experience of women who existed outside male authority requires seeing both the diversity of their strategies and the continuity of their quiet strength. Chapter 16: Threads of Independence, Patterns Across Medieval Women's Lives. If we pause for a moment and drift backward through all we've explored so far, a subtle pattern begins to emerge. Across convents, markets, estates, fields, and roads, medieval women found ways to live, work, and think independently, often quietly, often against the grain of expectation. Their lives were varied, yet certain threads of independence weave through nearly all of them. One thread is necessity as a driver of autonomy. Widows, merchant women, peasant laborers, and spinsters often claimed independence because circumstances demanded it. A husband dies. A trade is left unfinished. A childless woman must survive. In each case, necessity forces decision-making, responsibility, and authority into women's hands, sometimes temporarily, sometimes for decades. Another thread is skill and labor. Independence was rarely abstract. It was grounded in action. The merchant widow managing accounts, the peasant woman turning grain into bread, the itinerant healer carrying herbs and remedies, all exercised autonomy through competence. Skill in these cases was power. Even when social structures attempted to curtail influence, the ability to perform essential work ensured relevance and, at times, leverage. Community and networks form a third thread. No woman navigated medieval society entirely alone. Market women supported each other. Beguines formed semi-autonomous neighborhoods. Spinsters cultivated alliances and reputations that protected them and extended influence. Even the wandering merchant or healer relied on relationships of trust. Autonomy existed, in part, because women created informal structures of support. A fourth thread is adaptability. Medieval Europe was unpredictable: plague, famine, war, shifting laws, religious scrutiny. Women who lived independently often thrived because they could adapt, shifting trades, moving households, or negotiating contracts. Flexibility was not just practical, it was survival, and in survival lay quiet independence. We can also observe temporal autonomy. Some women exercised power in bursts, the widow overseeing estates until her son reached maturity, the beguine managing her household before joining a new community, the merchant moving from town to town seasonally. Independence was often conditional, fluctuating with circumstance, yet it remained real. Finally, intellectual and cultural autonomy emerges as a subtle but crucial thread. Christine de Pizan, female scribes, literate widows, and even folklore's marginal women shaped thought, culture, and knowledge without formal authority. They wrote, taught, healed, and transmitted wisdom, often unseen but enduring. Autonomy need not be public to be significant. Taken together, these threads reveal that women's independence in medieval Europe was rarely about breaking all rules or achieving fame. It was about making choices within constraints, subtle, pragmatic, and persistent. Each woman navigated a world built to limit her options, yet across centuries, countless women found ways to shape their lives, influence their communities, and leave traces in the historical record. The diversity of strategy is striking. A noblewoman might wield authority through property and marriage alliances. A beguine carved a spiritual and economic niche outside male oversight. A peasant managed survival and labor, blending necessity with knowledge of seasons. A spinster leveraged networks, craft, and discretion to maintain independence. Even wandering women transformed mobility into autonomy. Across all these lives, independence shares a rhythm. It is quiet, negotiated, and often invisible, yet its impact is tangible. Women shaped commerce, care, education, spirituality, and culture, all while navigating legal, social, and religious constraints. They are rarely celebrated in medieval chronicles, but their influence is woven through the fabric of everyday life, from the market stalls to the convent cells, from the fields to the roadways. In the next chapter, we will explore how male perceptions of independent women shape their lives, subtly and overtly, in ways both restrictive and ironic. Because autonomy never existed in a vacuum. It existed alongside suspicion, rumor, admiration, and occasional envy. And those reactions, in turn, shaped the strategies women used to maintain independence. Chapter 17. Male Perceptions and the Subtle Control of Independent Women. As we float further into the patterns of medieval female autonomy, it's important to consider the mirror, or perhaps the shadow, of independence. Male perception. For every woman who carved out a life without a husband, a male observer had an opinion, usually layered with suspicion, anxiety, or the faintest trace of grudging admiration. Men in positions of authority, whether local lords, clergy, or magistrates, often interpreted independent women as problems to be managed. A widow overseeing her late husband's estate could be seen as competent or as a potential troublemaker. A beguine providing charity might be praised for devotion or feared as a source of heresy. A spinster running a shop or producing goods independently might be tolerated for necessity, but socially marginalized to keep her in check. The church played a particularly complicated role. It promoted convents and marriage as the natural homes for women, framing them as moral obligations. But women who existed outside these frameworks were often scrutinized. Beguines were at times investigated for heresy. Widows who refused remarriage could be pressured to enter convents. Even peasant women were occasionally admonished for taking on roles considered male, such as managing land or negotiating labor. Yet male perceptions were not uniform. Some men respected and relied on independent women. A nobleman might recognize a widow's administrative skill or a merchant's acumen and depend on her judgment. Village men might quietly admire a healer's knowledge. Traders often engaged with women as business partners because it was practical. Necessity often overrode ideology. Still, the tension between utility and suspicion was constant. Independence itself was threatening because it implied agency beyond male control. A woman who could act, decide, and influence without oversight challenged the societal assumption that men were default authorities. Rumor, social pressure, and even legal mechanisms were tools used to regulate or restrain her autonomy. Interestingly, this dynamic sometimes led to irony. A male lord might complain about a widow controlling her property, yet seek her advice when problems arose. A priest might publicly caution against beguines' dangerous independence, while privately seeking their counsel or remedies. A local merchant might gossip about a spinster's character, yet purchase her goods and rely on her networks. Male perception, in short, created both constraints and opportunities. It dictated social judgment, sometimes limited legal authority, and occasionally threatened livelihood. But it also offered a space for negotiation. Women learned to navigate suspicion while maintaining autonomy, using discretion, alliances, and skill to operate effectively within the framework society imposed. This tension was particularly pronounced for women who lived alone. They were highly visible precisely because they deviated from the expected domestic or marital norm. Independence became a lens through which society interpreted behavior, often inaccurately. A woman's competence could be labeled arrogance, her charity labeled meddling, her literacy labeled dangerous knowledge. Yet these labels rarely erased her agency. If anything, they required more careful strategy. Male perception also shaped folklore, rumor, and legend. Independent women were often cast as witches, wise women, or meddling spinsters. Stories emphasized deviation from social norms, exaggerating autonomy into perceived threat. These narratives reinforced control while simultaneously acknowledging the women's influence. The very act of being independent became a story in itself. And yet, despite suspicion, surveillance, and occasional hostility, women persisted. They managed households, estates, trade, health, and spiritual communities. They moved, wrote, taught, and traded. Their lives were negotiated constantly, balancing autonomy with social constraints. Male perception shaped the environment, but it never entirely dictated behavior. From here, we can drift gently into the ways laws and regulations attempted to control independent women, the official codification of suspicion, obligation, and restriction, and how women found subtle ways to work within or around these rules. Chapter 18. Legal Constraints and Quiet Resistance. As we continue tracing the lives of women who lived independently in medieval Europe, it's impossible to ignore the legal framework surrounding them. Laws were designed to define, restrict, and control women, particularly those without husbands. Yet, as we've seen before, women often found ways to navigate, resist, or even exploit these constraints. In most of medieval Europe, marriage, inheritance, and property laws reinforced male authority. A woman's legal identity was often bound to her father or husband. Marriage transferred her legal rights to a husband. Widows or unmarried women were sometimes granted partial autonomy, but always with caveats. Control over property could be restricted. Contracts often required male witnesses or approvals. In towns, guilds frequently limited membership to men, affecting women's ability to practice trades formally. Widows often faced scrutiny over how they managed estates. Some legal codes required them to remarry within a certain period or risk losing property. Others allowed widowhood to serve as a temporary period of authority, but with the implicit understanding that the estate would eventually pass to a male heir. Even in cases where women legally controlled property, they often had to navigate social pressure from male relatives, neighbors, or local authorities who resented female autonomy. Yet legal constraints were not absolute. Women found ways to maintain independence through strategic compliance or subtle defiance. A widow might marry a less dominant man, retaining de facto control of her lands. A merchant woman might engage in trade under a male relative's name, yet handle the finances herself. A beguine could operate within church tolerance, performing charitable work while avoiding vows that might limit autonomy. Guild regulations and urban statutes also created challenges and opportunities. Women were often excluded from formal membership, yet could practice trades as widows of guild members or under temporary permissions. This legal gray area allowed some women to run businesses openly, while others operated discreetly. Skill and reputation became more important than formal status. Again, autonomy through competence. Religious law played another role. The church controlled marriage, inheritance rules in certain contexts, and even moral behavior. Independent women were sometimes accused of transgression, not necessarily because of wrongdoing, but because their autonomy itself challenged expectations. Beguines, spinsters, and widows occasionally faced investigations for heresy or moral impropriety. The mere act of living independently could provoke legal or ecclesiastical scrutiny. Despite these pressures, women cultivated networks of support and relied on knowledge of the law to navigate constraints. They learned loopholes, negotiated agreements, and leveraged social connections. Even when formal authority was denied, they found informal methods to exercise power. For example, a woman could influence local markets, charitable donations, or labor allocation through negotiation and reputation. The interplay of law and independence often created paradoxical spaces. Laws were intended to restrict, yet they sometimes acknowledged autonomy for widows, unmarried women, or certain religious groups. Women learned to exploit these spaces, balancing visibility with discretion, action with compliance. In essence, legal frameworks shaped the environment of independence, but did not entirely define it. Women who lived alone developed strategies to maintain agency within these constraints, demonstrating ingenuity, resilience, and subtle power. Autonomy was never absolute, yet it was meaningful. Even in a world dominated by male authority, women could maneuver, resist, and quietly influence society. From here, we can drift into another chapter exploring the social and cultural perceptions that both constrained and enabled independent women, the ways gossip, reputation, and folklore intersected with legal and social realities to shape daily life. Chapter 19: Reputation, Gossip, and the Invisible Influence of Independent Women. As we move gently forward, it's worth pausing to consider the social mechanisms that shaped the lives of independent women: reputation and gossip. In medieval Europe, a woman's social standing often depended less on formal authority and more on what others thought, whispered, or assumed about her. Independence, while empowering, came with constant scrutiny. A widow running her late husband's estate might be praised for competence in private but criticized in public for overstepping boundaries. A beguine who taught children or nursed the sick could be admired locally, yet rumors of impropriety or heresy might follow her like a shadow. Spinsters, particularly those living alone in towns or villages, were frequent subjects of gossip, sharp-tongued, meddlesome, or morally suspect, according to rumor. The paradox is striking. Social visibility could be both a source of power and vulnerability. Women who acted independently shaped communities, economies, and spiritual life, yet that influence often came wrapped in suspicion. It was a subtle form of control. A whisper could curtail agency as effectively as a law. Reputation was cultivated carefully. Independent women developed strategies to protect and leverage it. A widow might host charitable events, attend church observances punctually, or maintain a network of allies. A merchant woman could ensure fairness in transactions, gaining trust and repeat customers. Even a spinster, living quietly on the margins, could preserve her social standing through consistent labor, discretion, and occasional generosity. Gossip, though, was not entirely negative. It could also spread influence. Word of a competent healer, skilled artisan, or charitable beguine traveled quickly, drawing clients, apprentices, or patrons. Independent women learned to navigate this double-edged sword, using social perception to their advantage. Folklore played a role as well. The wandering witch, the wise old woman, the mysterious spinster. These archetypes reflected both fear and recognition of women who existed outside male control. Even exaggerated or fictionalized, these stories acknowledged a reality. Women could wield influence quietly, without formal titles or property. Stories served as cautionary tales, moral lessons, or entertainment, yet they also recorded the presence of female agency in ways official histories rarely did. Reputation and gossip intersected with law and social norms, creating a complex landscape. A woman's independence was always negotiated within the expectations of family, neighbors, church, and market. Success depended on skill, discretion, alliances, and timing. And yet, despite these constraints, women persisted, quietly reshaping the communities around them through labor, knowledge, and presence. The invisible influence of independent women extended across generations. Apprentices learned from widows, younger women from spinsters, and entire neighborhoods from beguines. Their cumulative effect is subtle but significant. The ordinary, everyday acts of autonomy created continuity, resilience, and adaptation in society. From here, we can drift into the next chapter, exploring the interplay between solitude and creativity, how living alone or independently allowed women to cultivate art, writing, and spiritual expression in ways constrained social structures often could not. Chapter 20: Solitude, Creativity, and the Inner Lives of Independent Women. As we float into the quieter corners of medieval life, it's worth reflecting on the relationship between independence and creativity. Women who lived alone or managed their own lives often found that solitude, while socially risky, offered space for reflection, writing, art, and spiritual practice. In a world defined by male authority, this inner life could become a source of subtle power. Consider widows who devoted themselves to writing letters, maintaining household records, or composing devotional texts. These acts of literacy were practical, documenting transactions, bequests, or agreements, but they also preserved personal thought, insight, and reflection. Women could record their observations, ethical judgments, and reflections on community life, creating an intellectual presence that outlasted their physical influence. Religious women, particularly beguines and anchoresses, often combined solitude with creativity. In closed spaces, prayer and reflection became fertile ground for mystical writing, poetry, and commentary. Hildegard of Bingen, though not entirely solitary, composed music, theology, and visions that remain influential. Mechthild of Magdeburg wrote with a personal voice, blending spirituality and introspection in ways that conventional male scribes rarely encouraged. Solitude allowed women to cultivate their inner world, producing works that navigated between devotion and personal expression. Creativity also emerged in practical forms. Independent women used craft, sewing, weaving, or embroidery to generate income and assert control over their lives. Patterns, symbols, and practical design became forms of self-expression, often integrated into daily survival. Art and labor intertwined, turning ordinary work into a medium of personal agency. Even for wandering women, solitude in motion could foster creativity. Traveling alone or in small groups offered time for observation, improvisation, and adaptive problem-solving. A merchant woman might devise new trade routes, innovate in packaging or marketing, or develop novel remedies for clients as she traveled. These creative strategies were born of necessity, but they also reflected autonomy and ingenuity. The inner lives of independent women were shaped not just by opportunity but by constraint. Isolation could be lonely, and societal judgment never fully disappeared. Yet within these constraints, women cultivated forms of personal and cultural creativity that extended influence beyond immediate circumstances. They wrote, healed, taught, crafted, and reflected, quietly shaping the intellectual, artistic, and spiritual landscape around them. It's also important to note the generational effect. A grandmother who managed property independently might teach literacy or craft to grandchildren. A beguine mentoring younger women transmitted spiritual insight and practical knowledge. A spinster sharing herbal remedies preserved medical knowledge for decades. In this sense, creativity and independence reinforced each other, creating continuity and resilience across time. Even where society attempted to suppress visibility, the inner life of independent women could be rich and influential. Solitude was not merely absence of control. It was a space for reflection, innovation, and subtle agency. The works produced, the knowledge transmitted, and the decisions made quietly altered the social fabric, leaving a legacy rarely celebrated but deeply felt. From here, we can drift into the next chapter, exploring the connections between independence, spirituality, and moral authority, how living alone often allowed women to shape ethical and religious life in ways men sometimes could not. Chapter 21: Independence and Spiritual Authority in Medieval Europe. As we drift gently further, we arrive at the intersection of independence and spiritual authority. Throughout medieval Europe, women who lived alone or independently often found that autonomy allowed them to exercise influence in religious life in ways that men did not expect, and sometimes could not fully control. Take the Beguines, for instance. These women lived in semi-religious communities without taking formal vows. They prayed, cared for the sick, and performed charity, often while managing their own finances. Because they were not bound by convent rules, Beguines had freedom to move, to negotiate with towns and clergy, and to shape their communities. Their spiritual authority was subtle but real. People sought their guidance, interpreted their visions, and relied on their counsel. Anchoresses offer another example. Enclosed in small cells, often attached to churches, they lived in voluntary solitude. Yet their influence was far-reaching. Pilgrims, parishioners, and even local authorities sought advice and blessings. By choosing seclusion, these women gained a kind of moral and spiritual authority unavailable to most married or socially bound women. Ironically, confinement provided them with power. Independent women also shaped religious practice through writing and correspondence. Letters of advice, devotional texts, and mystical treatises allowed women to reach audiences across distances, spreading influence quietly. Hildegard of Bingen, again, demonstrates this vividly. Her visions, letters to popes and nobles, and theological works were enabled by her autonomy and spiritual credibility. Independence, in this sense, was both the medium and the message. Widows, too, could claim moral and spiritual authority. Free from the obligations of marriage, they might sponsor chapels, donate to religious institutions, or fund charitable works. Their contributions carried weight not only because of wealth, but because independence lent credibility. They were not acting on behalf of husbands, fathers, or sons, but on their own judgment. Society often accepted this authority, though it could be begrudgingly acknowledged. Even marginal or peripheral women exercised spiritual influence. Spinsters, wandering women, and healers who lived alone were sometimes consulted for guidance on moral or practical dilemmas. Communities recognized practical wisdom as a form of ethical insight. A woman's independence could therefore translate into spiritual as well as social authority. There is an interesting paradox here. The more socially constrained women were in formal hierarchies, the more some could exercise moral and spiritual power outside those hierarchies. Living alone, choosing solitude, or managing resources without male oversight often positioned women as arbiters of ethics, mediators of conflict, or sources of advice. Authority did not always flow from office or title. Sometimes it flowed from autonomy itself. In this way, independence, creativity, labor, and spirituality intertwine. Women who lived alone navigated legal and social constraints, cultivated skills, preserved knowledge, and exercised moral influence. Their autonomy was both practical and symbolic, shaping daily life and the spiritual landscape. From here, we can gently drift into the next chapter, exploring the daily rhythms of independent women, how work, prayer, social interactions, and household management combined to create a life that was self-directed, even within the confines of medieval society.